Just a quick heads up before we start. On Sandwiched, we talk honestly about life, loss, and caregiving. That means conversations may touch on topics such as death and grief. We invite you to listen with care, and please do step away if you need to. Welcome back to Sandwiched. I'm Paul Richardson, your host. And today is a very special episode, not only because it's the final episode of season 1, but also because I have invited in someone who is incredibly close and important to me. Over the course of season 1, we've talked with caregivers from all walks of life: parents, adult children, partners, and professionals. And today, we're going to close out season 1 with a powerful intergenerational story about what it means to care for others while you yourself are also aging. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Diane Aden. Diane is my grandmother. So for our listeners, I will refer to her as Gram, but her legal name is Diane Aden. She's a longtime realtor, a former HR executive, and whether she ever would use the word or not, she's been a family caregiver multiple times throughout the course of her life. She's been sandwiched between work, caregiving at a distance, loss, and also navigating her own journey. Graham, thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So before we get started, how are you feeling about joining me on Sandwiched?
I feel good about it. I think what you're doing is important work. I've been watching, and I've learned something from everyone. Many things that I wish I'd have known when I was doing it.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Obviously, as anyone can imagine, a family member being a supporter is always good, but I'm glad that there's been tools that you could add to your own toolbox. So I'm sure that our listeners will also gain some knowledge from you as well. So before we really start to dive in, just tell people a little bit more about yourself. Obviously, I did a quick intro, but why don't you share more about yourself for our listeners?
Well, I grew up in a pretty modest home. My dad was hardworking. My mother was a home mother, taking care of the house. My mother went to the 8th grade, so she never entered the workforce except for a very short period. We grew up, as I said, modestly. Sometimes that was, to me it was always normal, but sometimes it was pointed out to me by people who were less modest. But basically I grew up with pretty good, I think, base of humanity, caring for people. My mother was extremely social. The old time, this ages me, but back in the 50s, the coffee clutch was a really big thing. My mother always had coffee at her house and people visiting. So I got a big exposure to life all, from back then till now.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So when you think back, obviously you're a mother. And when I'm talking about caregiving in today's context, I want to think about caregiving for others, other adults. Obviously, you're a caregiver for children and grandchildren, but I think that's really just kind of for framing of the context. When do you remember a first moment or opportunity or situation where you stepped into what we at Sandwich would define as caregiving for someone else?
Probably when my dad died. He died at 49, tragically of a blood clot in his heart. My mother was 42.
Oh.
She had never worked, didn't know how to drive, had never really been the one that went grocery shopping. And if she went with my dad to pick stuff out, she had very little understanding of finances. And when he died, she was really in a state of emotional shock for about the first year. And my sister and I were both married with kids, and my brother was 13, still at home. So we kind of had to both step in. Luckily, we all lived in the same neighborhood. So I could run over, after work, before work, or when I was at home having babies. I think my first baby was 6 months old when my dad died. Which was also a big loss for me, not just losing my dad, but knowing he would never know my kids other than Eric, the first one, who he did come and see just about every day. My sister had 4 kids. At that point, she had 3. And she was down the street, and we would both take turns going over and checking on my mom. The neighbors, because of the coffee clutch that I talked about, also went over to take care of her. She really had to more or less see the world for the first time because my dad had been very protective of her. I always say he pampered her a lot. But yeah, so that was the first time.
It's interesting. I've heard this story or parts of it many times in my life, but I never heard you say she was 42. So I'm 42.
Oh.
So it hit a little differently when you mentioned it.
Yeah.
At the time of this recording, I'm a single person, but I have been in relationships in my past, so I can't imagine kind of what that looks like. I don't think anybody in their 40s expects to lose a partner or a spouse. That's tough. I mean, you certainly didn't expect to lose your dad so young.
Right. And my dad was my hero, so... but my mother, another noteworthy thing about her past that made this even more tragic was she grew up on a farm in Chesaning, Michigan, and she was one of 7 kids. And when her youngest brother was born, their mother died in childbirth.
Okay.
And so my grandfather was still a fairly young man with now 7 children to raise on his own. And so she suffered the loss of having a mother for many, 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 many years until at one point going to live with an aunt. But she was older by then because she also had to help care for the kids. I mean, the younger, I remember my youngest uncle, who's still alive, just turned 99, called her mom. And she was just a few years older than him, but he always called her mom.
Yeah, probably didn't really know anything different than that.
Right.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, and there's kind of an intersection of not only were you caregiving for your own children, but you were helping to step in with your mom and also a little bit with your younger brother because he was still a teenager.
Right.
But you're also trying to navigate the loss of your father.
Right.
What was that like, trying to navigate the grief
amongst
everything else?
Yeah, that was really hard. He died while driving a truck. He was, my dad was a very likable person, somewhat stoic, but he had a lot of friends in his industry, and I knew all the stories about, his friends and him would go load their trucks every day and then stop and have breakfast. And, just to tell you the kind of guy he was, his buddies and him met for breakfast like just about, probably not every morning because sometimes they were long distance drivers, sometimes it was within the state. But they would meet for breakfast and get together. Well, my mother was a jokester, which is, I think, one of the reasons my dad adored her. And she would, they both smoked terribly. And my dad would go to bed and get up at 3 a.m. to leave for work. My mother was a night hawk. So while she was in bed, sometimes he would take all his cigarettes out of the pack and write notes and letters and drawings on them and leave the last 2 or 3 plain so that by the time he got to one of those, he would be in the restaurant with his friends having breakfast and then pulling out a cigarette, which would have a joke in it. Sometimes she used to make his lunch in the early days, and she would put love notes in his sandwiches right in the middle of them and silly things like that. So, that was, he was just a very likable guy. When he died, my whole family, everybody, was stunned that there were 250 people at his funeral. I went on his truck with him to places like Chicago and the Upper Peninsula, places like that, and got to spend time with him and meet lots of his friends. And he used to pay me a quarter for, and I think it started out a nickel and ended up a quarter for every hour I could talk to him while he was driving, make sure he stayed awake.
Keep him
or
awake.
at least that's what he used to tell me. So, I was all for that. And then when we get to our destination, there'd always be some little store or truck stop or something. He'd let me go spend the money. So, he was just the kind of guy that you couldn't help but miss. And I had a very difficult first pregnancy, nearly lost my life. And so my dad came every day to see me and check on me until he died. So that was a tremendous loss for me. And my mother was so torn up and lost herself. She couldn't really give too much to us because my brother was there, he needed her, and she was just lost. I mean, where do you go from a place like that where your life is pretty simple and you're taken care of, and you're I guess we're lucky to have the life we had, even though we were kind of on the poor side. You know, not driving, not having finished high school. I mean, I just can't imagine how it looked to her.
Yeah, and she later remarried and
Yes.
had life, and you also relocated, so you're no
Yes.
longer in the neighborhood.
Yes.
A handful of years later, probably 5 or 6 years after that.
She married one of my dad's dearest friends, and we had a cabin up north in Michigan in Gladwin, and I think it was probably a year or two before my dad died that they bought that cabin on the lake. It was on the Tittabawassee River. And my dad bought a speedboat, and we had skis, and he took us skiing. And I fished off the dock with him a lot until he'd get mad because I'd catch more fish than him. And so my mother was afraid of the water, so she would never go down on the dock or anything. It was a big, big loss for me and just everybody who knew him, really.
Yeah.
And my mom was just so lost. I was always worried about her. She would stay in bed for hours. She just didn't know what to do with herself.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot we could cover, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So let's fast forward. I guess that would have been probably 3 or 4 decades. And let's start talking about as she started to get older. You were living out of state. You were living probably about 2,000 miles away at that time. And like many of us, as we're aging, we need more support, whether it's logistical, financial, emotional, health related. There's kind of a lot of logistics. When did you start kind of stepping again to help with a caregiver type of role with her?
Well, in my job, I traveled across the U.S. and Canada. I had responsibilities across the U.S. as a HR manager for what was then known as a ITT division. And I would always, wherever I would go in the Midwest or East Coast, I would route my weekend. I would add on my ticket, paid for by me, of course, but I would add on my ticket to stop in Michigan and see my mother. So if I was working, let's say Tuesday through Friday night, I'd land in Michigan, see my mother, leave Sunday for home. And at that time, my stepfather, who I adored, that had been my dad's closest friend, he had died of a heart attack, and my mother was alone initially, and then she met up with an old friend and companion, but she was actually afraid to marry him because she was afraid he would die.
Yep.
But they were together for over 20 years, and he helped take care of her, so I wasn't too terribly worried about her, although she always had health issues even when I was a kid. She was in and out of the hospital for different medical problems. But I noticed around the early 90s, I was moved. I worked for Intel, and I moved to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, and my mother and Dell came out to visit for 3 months. And of course, I still had to work, still had to travel, but I noticed my mother's memory was off. And the thing that kind of got me was she would say, "What can I do for you while you're gone on your trip?" and I really didn't have anything for her to do. So I had a doll collection that I had collected over the years, and I had them sitting on a buffet type of thing in a room, and I thought, well, those dresses are pretty dirty on those dolls. I'll see if she wants to hand wash them because they can't be put in a washing machine. And so I asked her if she wanted to do that while I was gone, and she was, oh, yeah, I can do that. And when I came back, she had the dolls laying in my bed, and she said, you're going to be really mad at me. And I said, why? And she said, because I think I shrunk some of those dresses. And I said, no, I don't think so. And she said, yeah, I did. And I said, well, show me. And I went in, and she had put the large doll's dress on the little doll and the little doll's dress on the large doll, and she couldn't figure it out. And that made me have a red flag, like, uh-oh. Well, then later that week, I opened the refrigerator door, and there were a pair of socks in there. Mm. And I said, how'd these socks get in the fridge? And she goes, I don't know. She goes, gosh, I wonder if I did that. So that was my first warning. So I started paying attention. And as each time I visited her, I realized more and more she was getting, less memory. Then I moved to California in the early 2000s, and they came out there to visit and stayed a couple months. And I noticed she was much worse. And we would go out to the restaurant, and I had a white car at the time. And she would come out of the restaurant and go right to the very first white car and try to get in it. And I would say, Mom, that's not my car. And she was struggling in ways like that. They were a little more obvious. I talked to Del about it, and he goes, yeah, she's kind of forgetting a lot of stuff. He wasn't too concerned. I don't think he had a lot of awareness about Alzheimer's. And so it just continued to progress. Then she got very ill, and I flew out there and took her to the doctor and found out she had colon cancer. And she could not comprehend that. The doctor was talking to her. I was in the room, and she said, Irma, you have colon cancer. We're going to need to do surgery. And she goes, oh, no, I don't have cancer. Mm-hmm. And the doctor was talking to her and asking her questions about pain and back pain. And my mother was lying to her. And I realized that in my mother's head, from the generation she came from, you told people more what you thought they wanted to hear. So she denied having back pain, even though I had bought her a special chair because she liked sitting at the table most of the day, because her back was always killing her. So I noticed that, and I realized she was lying to the doctor because I knew what she was saying was not true. So I said, Mom, I'll be right back. The doctor was going to go out and do something, and I said, I'm going to go run to the restroom where she's doing that. And I caught up with the doctor, and I said, you may not be aware of this because you've never seen my mother before, but she just lied to you about everything. She's got Alzheimer's. She is not comprehending that she has cancer. So you need to know that. We're going to proceed with the surgery, of course, but I need you to know that she cannot get it, that she has cancer. So that made it really difficult for everybody. But she was happy, and everybody goes, well, maybe it was good she had Alzheimer's because she didn't really ever realize she had cancer. But I don't really agree with that, because it was hard to get her to do things she needed to do because she could not comprehend that. And when they put her in the hospital, or while we were in that doctor's office, she said to me, well, whatever they're going to do to me should be free. And I said, why is that? And she says, because I've been in here enough times, I probably paid for this building. And she'd never been in that building before. So we went from there to my sister and I went up for the surgery. My brother came up. He lived in Michigan, so he could see her a little more conveniently, but he had a big job, or not a big job, but he was, really busy working and had kids of his own and everything, where my kids were grown, or almost grown by then, all of them. But it was hard going back and seeing her and trying to do things for her. But I would go back for important doctor's appointments. And about a year later, Dell was keeping really good eye on her. He would go to the store, he would go out, take care of his own house, and come back and be with her. He stayed there with her most of the time. And so he couldn't watch her all the time. And I found that she was doubling up medicine. He would put her medicine in a cup. And then when I was there, I'd watch her take it. And then later on the day when he was gone, she'd say, "Oh, I forgot to take my medicine." So he and I got a lockbox that he had to unlock every day, which she couldn't get into. They had a cabinet for food in the laundry room, a pantry like. And so I said, let's put a lock on that. And so you put out food for her every day that she can make, but let's lock that up so she can't get that medicine except when you give it to her. So we did that. I wasn't too worried about her going out in the lakeside by the water because I knew she was afraid of water, but I was worried about her getting too much medicine. So that kind of took care of that for a while. Then I would call her and she would, you could tell the memory was in and out. Sometimes she always recognized my voice, but sometimes it took a couple minutes. And then my sister went up to visit because she hadn't been there in a year, and she went up to visit. And while she was there, my mother got very sick, and they had to take her to the hospital again. Well, my sister had to come home to go to work, and we found out that the cancer was back. And this time it was really everywhere, and we knew this was not going to end well. And she again did not comprehend that she had cancer because she never got it the first time. And it was at a point now where Dell could not take care of her. I wanted her to come to California because I thought I could probably, have her at my home and have part-time nurse there. And she did not want to leave her house. She loved the cabin. She had sold her house where we grew up, and she loved the cabin. She loved that she had wild turkey in the yard every year or every day, and deer in the yard. And, she just loved the piece of that. And my aunt and uncle were up there, and they would get together and play cards and stuff. And I don't know how they did it with her memory like that, but they managed. And my mother would sit at her table and read me an article in the paper, and then 5 minutes later read it to me 2 or 3 more times, But so I realized that this was really not really fair to Dell either. He told me he was scared to take care of her now after this second surgery. So my sister and I and a cousin went looking for a place locally. There was really nothing in her town that was appropriate for her care. So my cousin lived in Fenton, Michigan, and she lived across a small, it was a creek that led to a lake. But anyway, she lived across from that, from a home, a recovery home or rehabilitation or long-term care, whatever. And it wasn't, we went to several that we did not care for, nor could she afford. But my cousin said, if you put her there, I will stop by work every single day and check on her, because when you check on people in homes like that, they get better care. So that's what we ended up doing. And my cousin very faithfully went and saw my mother every day. She would do her fingernails for her. My mother always liked that. And talked to her and took her laundry home because the laundry would go missing, and did things like that. So that went on for about 8 or 9 months, but she was getting worse and worse and worse. And I would go up. I probably went up there 3 or 4 times in that year. And then they called me and said, we need to put her on hospice. And before that, she had called me a few times and would demand that I come and get her because she thought she was in a crazy house, she called it. So that was another thing. I'd get a call in the middle of the night from the nursing staff, and I would have to talk her down. And I would have to get her calmed down so that I could tell her I would see her very soon and I would take care of it, because I knew she would not remember the next day if I could get her to calm down, which she didn't remember. So anyway, we put her in hospice care, and about 3 or 4 days later, the manager called me and he said, "You better get up here. It's not long now. It's really bad. And do you want to take her to the hospital?" And I said, "No, I promised her I would never make her live unknowingly like a vegetable, more or less." She had a colostomy bag. She never could understand why she had it. She pulled it off every single day, couldn't figure out what it was. It was just awful for her. So I called my sister, and she didn't think she could leave work because she'd just gotten back from that vacation up there. And I called her boss and said, "This is it. I need her to be able to go." We met in Phoenix, flew up there, got my brother, and went up. And she didn't really know who either one of us are by face. But once we started talking and she heard our voices, then she knew us. But she was in really bad shape and in a lot of pain. And so they were making her comfortable. And from there, it's so funny. I was going to the gym just about every day, 5 days a week or so anyway, at home. So I had made arrangements with a gym across from the hospital. And I told my sister I was pretty stressed out. I said, "I need to go work some of this off. I'm going to go across, do a few exercises, and I'll be back." And I got over to the gym, got on my gym clothes, went out and started exercising, had a feeling, just grabbed my stuff, got in the car, drove across the street. And as I was walking up the sidewalk, my sister was running out, telling me not to go in, that she was passed. So she passed while I was over there. And for me, it was like she knew she wanted to do that while I was gone, because it was going to be devastating. And the manager came out and got me, the hospice guy, and I went in, and it was, of course, she was free from all the pain, but it was still hard because there was no coming back from what she had, and the second round of cancer was everywhere. So that was, how do you now not have that caretaking? So now you got to transition back to your normal life and mourn that loss and kind of relive the loss of your dad, because he wasn't there either. And it was hard. It was really hard.
So I want to go back to a couple of moments. One is when I think back to the story about when they visited you in New Mexico and the situation with the putting the wrong doll clothes on the wrong dolls and the socks in the refrigerator. Did you ever have conversations with her about her memory?
I did try to. I said, "Are you having a little problem remembering things?" And she goes, "Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I just can't think of a name or something." But for the most part, I think she was just thinking it was old age.
Okay.
Since she never got the concept of having cancer, never understood exactly what those surgeries were. But she'd had a lot of surgeries in her life. When I was 11, she was in the hospital 6 months with a surgery where they accidentally cut something in her ureter tube. And back then, it just seems almost, when I look back, like before, it was almost like, seemed like it was before real medicine, because she was in the hospital 6 months trying to survive that. And I was 11, and because I wasn't 12, I wasn't allowed to visit her in the hospital. So, I was kind of like, she never, ever understood her illnesses very well. She knew she was sick, but she just trusted the doctors 100%. And, if she could sit and look outside and do her reading multiple times a day, and Dell was there, and he, they spent their time together, and she watched TV, um, watched her geese outside. She was happy.
Yeah.
She wasn't sad.
For me, really kind of where the question was coming from, obviously, because I got to know her before and during a lot of the kind of those transitional periods, before the memory loss and then after as well. One of the benefits I always share with people is having such young parents and young grandparents means I got to know my great grandparents, which not a lot of people do. But I think really, as I'm thinking about others who might be experiencing similar situations, a lot of caregivers struggle with how to have the conversation, how to open the door to the conversation, or similar to you, where it's maybe they don't live close by, so they don't see them every day or every week. And I feel like sometimes those of us that are further away, we can see the changes easier. It's kind of like when kids, right?
Yeah.
If you're not around kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, when I see them, it may have only been 3 or 4 months, but it's like, oh my gosh, they've changed so much.
Right.
Whereas you tell the parent and they're like, really? I don't think so, because they see them every day.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of similar to that. Did you and Delmer ever talk about it?
Yeah, we talked about it a lot, and we worked together to figure out the best strategies around her day-to-day life. And they used to go out and eat, and it was a little town. Gladwin's a little town. He would take her out to eat. They knew everybody, and he was quite a talker. So my mom was just happy to be out, seeing people, getting to eat out. She loved that. He would take her to get her hair done. He explained to the girls that she had Alzheimer's, because they knew her before that. They lived up there for years. So, everybody kind of knew. If they knew her at all, they knew, and they, acted accordingly. And he would take her to the hairdresser, leave her there, come back and get her. Then they'd go out to eat, and then he'd take her back home, and she would be really happy. She loved my aunt and uncle that were up there. It was one of her brothers and his wife, and my other aunt, one of my other aunts, was up there for a while, but then she got ill and went back down to Fenton to live with her daughter. So, my mother was not a miserable person ever that I can remember. Even in all the sickness and illness, she was always sort of in her own, I guess I'd say almost in her own little world of happiness. And as long as people were around and she was having people to talk to and joke with, her and my one aunt, my closest aunt, I always called them Lucy and Ethel, because that's how they acted together. Always jokes. So, I felt bad that everything happened to my mom that did, but I also saw her from this other perspective of she just liked having fun. She liked joking. She liked people. And, I always wonder sometimes what her life would have been like if she'd been born a little later in life than she was, because the world was different, but she seemed like a happy person most of the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I'm not saying that the kids, including me, didn't make her mad.
Well, I think that's part of the journey. I think that all...
she certainly had that side too.
Yes, I think all children and parents drive each other nuts at different points, and children and grandparents and all of that. Yeah, so let's, continue kind of through your caregiving journey, and let's talk about your sister. So when you moved back to Arizona, and I think it was when you were, at the time, you were in a job where you were doing coding.
Yes.
For healthcare.
Yes.
Lots of careers in your life, lots of careers that you've experienced. You had decided to move back to Arizona to be near family.
Right.
And if memory serves, when you were moving back, you had asked your sister if she wanted to live with you, or how did that conversation go?
Well, when I left corporate America, I thought I would just retire a little bit early. Bored out of my mind. I did a couple of different careers because I didn't really want to go back to corporate again. I was there for like 30 years. And I loved it. I loved it. I would have done my job for free if I could have afforded it because I loved it. Um, but I didn't want to go back to that kind of hard, driving timeline, traveling everywhere. I'd lived in Europe for a couple of years and all of that. And I was, flying 220,000 miles a year, 1 year. I was kind of tired of that part. So I decided to do something quieter. And so I left California when the market dropped. I was a realtor at that time, and the market dropped everywhere. And I really didn't want to stay in California. I had expenses there that I just thought were beyond what might happen with this recovery from that drop. So I moved. I sold my home and I moved to Colorado, bought a home there, and thought about becoming another HR manager for a smaller company, but my age was in the way. I was 57, and I would get interviews up to the top two candidates, and then they would say, well, and I would see the other top candidate usually because we were scheduled close by each other, but I knew my age was an issue, and I thought, well, I'm not going to fight this. I'll do something different. So I went back to school, became a medical coder, thinking I'd be a coder or a biller, not thinking I would really do the coding, thinking I'd want to do the billing. But in fact, I really loved the coding. And I think it came from so many years of solving people problems that it was kind of nice to be me and my computer. And I had an interest in it, and I was a wound care specialist in that. So anyway, I was living in Colorado, and my sister was struggling greatly financially. She was divorced, and she had issues after her divorce that she could not mentally, socially overcome, lack of confidence. And she worked in jobs that making retirement for her really, really difficult. And so I had an illness, a major illness, and some surgeries while I was in Colorado, and the hospital was really good to me because having been an employee in a hospital, even though I wasn't in their hospital, they were very good about staying with me through my, medical time off, and they let me come back gradually, and they asked me to work at home earlier than my illness because the hospital was full. The offices were full. They were running out of room. They asked me if I'd mind working at home, and I had a formal office at home, so I agreed to do that. And it just worked out that when I had my surgeries, I was able to recoup at home and gradually come back into the workforce. And then my daughter was talking to me. She lived in Montana, and I had a son in Nashville, and I had another son in Montana, and she said, I really wish you'd go live by family again. And I was thinking about it because that was a difficult time. She had to fly up and take care of me. Now I was being taken care of. She took care of me. As you know, you took care of me. My son Eric took care of me. My niece Laura took care of me. You all took turns coming up to see me through my recovery. And it was difficult because there really wasn't, my neighbors were great, my friends were great, but I knew my daughter was right that I should probably do something about getting closer to family physically. So my sister and I talked just about every day, and I knew she was really struggling and really wanting to retire. She was really, really having a hard time. So I told her, I said, well, Holly wants me to move back with my family, and I don't want to live in Montana. I don't want to be in the cold. I don't want to live in Nashville. I don't want to be in the humidity. I think I'll come back to Arizona. And I said, if you want to retire and live with me, you can. I said, I don't see us living in your townhouse. I think it's too small. But I said, if you decide you want to live with me, you can. But in any case, I'll be there, and I can try to help you. And of course she said, don't come back just for that. And I said, no, it's not just because of that. But the truth is, I wanted to be able to help her. I had helped her many times through her life, and I knew she was also kind of like my mother and struggling with loss when her husband left. She just had a hard time with that through the years. So I came back and I stayed with her for 6 months. I kept my job. I tried to resign in Colorado. They wouldn't take my resignation, asked me if I'd take my job with me. So I did for 2 or 3 years. And I told my sister, I am going to look for a house, with, more bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and all of that. And I said, you can live with me if you want. You don't have to, but I will try to help you. And so she decided, I found a house I liked, and it happened to be on the other side of town, and that was upsetting to her. But I said, I just really can't afford to live on your side of town. And was near ASU, and things were much more expensive. So I said, you'll have to make that decision. I can still come over on a regular basis every week, but I'm going to live on the other side of town. I chose to live in Surprise. So about 6 months, well, I bought my house in June, and in September she called me and said, I'm ready to sell my house and move in with you. And so she did. And there was some adjustment for both of us. Being sisters, there's going to be some differences, and we worked through those, and we actually had a pretty good time. I had a little more of a social life than her. Her friends had all kind of moved away. She was down to seeing 1 or 2 friends occasionally, so she was alone a lot when she wasn't at work. So I was here and doing my work, and then catching up with people, old friends and stuff. But she and I took a couple of trips. We took one trip for a month after I quit working. I was going to try retirement again, and we drove across the United States to see different members of the family, and we were gone a whole month, and we had a great time. I'll always treasure that trip. So we did that. We came back, and then my daughter and her husband decided to move to Arizona. And my daughter said, are you happy retired? I said, no, I'm bored. And she said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, real estate's coming back up. Let's go back. Let's go into real estate. You can do this. You're smart. I've been there before. Let's go into real estate. And we went and got our real estate licenses and started working here. And so my sister was home here alone, but I was home every night. And I noticed that she was doing well for a while, but she had AFib and heart conditions and things, and those were getting a little worse. And she went through some hard times. She had COVID. She had some serious other issues and was hospitalized. And so I was back in the caretaking mode. And when she was in the hospital, I was there every single day. I knew that while I was moved away, she had called me and asked me if I would be her representative on her trust and be her trustee and her healthcare person. She had 4 kids. They didn't all get along great. They weren't bad, but they didn't get along great. And she figured that I could be the neutral person and make sure her wishes were taken care of. And so I agreed to do it, thinking this is a long way off. And here we are, and she's in the hospital, and I had to enforce some of those things while she was in really bad shape. And so I brought her home from the hospital after the one serious illness, and then she got COVID and went back, and then she came home and she was better again. And then she started failing big time. She started getting AFib very frequently, and I was calling the ambulance frequently, getting her back to the hospital. eventually she couldn't walk without a walker. Eventually she had to have oxygen. So we had oxygen in the house plus a portable unit. And I figured out the restaurants where we could plug her unit in because it didn't last a really long time. So if we went out she wanted to go to the store or something, I couldn't trust that it would last. So I would find the restaurants that had plugs by the eating area that I could plug her unit into. And those are the restaurants we went to on a regular basis so she could get out of the house. And then she got worse. And then I was helping her get into bed, having to lift her up onto the bed because she just couldn't do it on her own, putting her eye drops for glaucoma in every night, and, hooking making sure the oxygen was hooked up properly and things like that. And I would sleep with my door open so that I could hear her if she called for me. And then she was having some struggles. She'd have AFib and she'd get up, but then she couldn't breathe. And I wore hearing aids and I couldn't hear her, so she would have to make enough noise that I could hear it and get up to help her. And that was a little bit concerning because, you only have so long to call an ambulance and get her regulated. So we went through many rounds of that, into the hospital and out, get her regulated. And so then she got where I wouldn't say her memory was bad other than one hospitalization where it was caused from the medical situation. And her memory bounced back after that. She was kind of like the trivia queen. She could remember everything and everybody anywhere in her lifetime. And she was like the person I would call and say, "What, do you remember this? Or can you tell me about this? Or who is this person?" And she always knew. So it was really hard to see her struggle. And then I found that she was not eating properly. And my sister was always cold, even in the summer, in the winter. And she wore 2 or 3 layers of clothes every day. And she was losing weight. And I was concerned that she might have cancer. And because of COVID, they had canceled things like colonoscopies and scans and things like that. So we couldn't find out if those were issues. But I knew for sure the heart was the issue, for sure that had to be dealt with. And so I went to all her appointments with her. Then they had her going to various specialists, and sometimes 3 times a week, 4 times a week, kidney specialists after COVID, and going to a hematologist because her iron would keep dropping, and I would have to take her for a transfusion and things like that. And I never wanted to put her in a home. None of us want that. And if I thought that that would be something that my family needed to not have to have that burden, I would probably agree to it, but it's not something I want. And she didn't want that. And she wanted me close. So I tried to do it at home, and I was still working as a realtor. So I hired a home health aide to come in for 3 to 4 hours or 5 hours a day, depending. And so I would go to work and then come home, and I told them to make sure she ate, even if they had to feed her, because many times I had to feed her, and to make sure that she got, they would help her with her shower, and to make sure she took her medicine. And I told them, you have to be sure that she's taking it, because I found it hidden in the cupboard one time. She was looking like she was taking it, but she put it in a little container, and I found it in the buffet. And I thought, So I was always trying to figure out what she was not doing in order to compensate for that. And then she got to the point where she couldn't get on and off the toilet, and I almost dropped her one day, and the aide was here just leaving, and I yelled for her, and she came in and helped me catch her. I had her kind of half caught, and then I realized that I was going to have to do something different. So I talked to her kids, and we kind of all agreed that she should probably go into a care facility. It was not going to get a lot better than that. She had come out of the shower one day and or was going to take a shower one day, and she had her pajamas on, and she called me into the bathroom. And it was the biggest shock of my life because she was always in this 3 layers of clothes. She was just skin and bones. And I was like totally shocked. I'm living with this woman. I know her, I see her, I talk to her every day, I put her in bed at night, but I had never seen her without being bundled up. And it was like, I felt like I was looking at Auschwitz again, like somebody who hadn't been fed. And I had been feeding her, so I knew she was getting some food, but I realized that in my absence, she was not eating. She was probably throwing the food away. And so my daughter and I went out and we found a local home where I could be there in 15 minutes. And I knew my sister was intimidated by large groups. So we opted not to go to the big nursing home, but go to a in-home care facility that held 8 patients. And I fully thought we'd get her in there and maybe she would recover enough to come back home. And I went every day to see her. They had restricted visitation, so I could only go at lunchtime and then after work for like 2 hours. But I went every day. And she was having a hard time talking on the phone. Her voice was going. I felt like there was a lot more going on, but I couldn't. I only know what the doctors told me, and they told me she was probably dying. And so the nursing center said, I think you should put her on she was in a wheelchair at the time when we took her there. And after about a week or two, she couldn't even get in and out of the wheelchair. So they said, I think you need to put her on hospice, and then everybody will come to her and everything like that, instead of you having to take her to all these various doctors. So I talked to her primary doctor, and she recommended that I do that. And so that's what we did. She was in there from April till July, and then I noticed, she was progressively getting worse. They were giving her all kinds of stuff to try to get more nutrition to build up in her, but it wasn't working. And so I was getting very worried. And I think in a way she gave up. I think there's a part of her that wanted to die and a part of her that didn't want to die. But I went up and something was very different. And I talked to the home manager and I said, something's wrong, something's happened to her. And she said, yes, she's getting worse. And I said, I got to take her to the hospital. And they said, well, on hospice, you can't really do that. I said, what do you mean? I can do that. I can take her to the hospital. She said, you'll have to take her off hospice and then take her, otherwise they won't cover it. And I said, well, then take her off hospice because I want her to go to the hospital. And so they had me sign a paper, took her off hospice, took her to the hospital with an ambulance, followed up there, and the doctor called me out of the ER into the hallway and said, your sister's had a stroke and she is not going to make it. And she had some physical issues. She said those are too far gone. She's not going to come out of this. And so, I called her family. There was, I had the relatives her kids that weren't here. I had the doctor. The doctor told me they couldn't fix any of it, that she would not survive anything further. So I should take her back to hospice. And I still went up every day. I sent for her daughter. She came down and visited with her. My daughter called my brother. He flew down and visited her, and everybody got to see her. As bad as it was, she did know we were all there. She did know that I was there every day, but she couldn't talk. She got where she couldn't talk at all. And that was a very short period of time, and then she seemed to level off a little bit. And I got a call one morning from the manager, and she said, "Your sister was fine 2 hours ago, but she's made a turn. You better get up here quick." I hit the road. I only had 15 minutes drive. On the way, my daughter called me, and she was out at an appointment and just finished. And she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I just got the call to get to Linda as fast as possible." And she said, "I'm right by there. I'll go over and meet you there." And I pulled in, and I got up to the door, and the worker came out and said, "She's passed." And my daughter was with her. I'm grateful she was there because she crawled in bed with her and held her and sang to her. So.
Yeah. So different situations. Your sister was living with you for, I think it was about the last 10 years you guys lived together, right? Whereas with your mom, there was, you were visiting often, but there was, 2,000 miles between. I think there's layers of uniqueness in each of the stories, but what are some of the similarities between being a caregiver in both situations, and what were some of the differences?
I think the similarities were that with my mom, I didn't have to do so much of the physical stuff.
Okay.
Del wasn't a assertive guy. He was a very mellow, easygoing guy. I had to figure out the financial stuff. I had to make sure all that was set up properly and that all her bills were covered. And I always left money in the drawer when I went up there and made sure that my mother wouldn't ask for something usually. Once in a while she would ask for help, but usually she wouldn't. So I never went to my mother's house ever that I didn't leave a few $100s in her drawer for her to discover, to help with whatever she needed. And with my sister, she had me on her checking account, or had me not on her checking account, but on her financial stuff to take that over. So I had one of her sons come over and went over everything with him and said, "These are all being paid automatically. This one has to be paid," and blah, 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 and took care of that. So those were similar. But with my sister, because she was in my home and because we'd always been pretty close the last 30 or 40 years after our kids were kind of getting around, I had to take care of her physically. And none of the kids were in a place where they were feeling they could take her. And I knew I was really the one who had the more flexible schedule that could do that. And I wanted to see her, and I wanted to still talk to her and stuff. So I think taking care of her was much harder than taking care of my mom. And I had some surprises in that caretaking experience, of the shock of not being able to do it all, not being able to be everything that she needed at the time she needed it. And sometimes I'm sorry I took her to the home. She wanted to preserve her money that she made on her house to give her kids. And she asked me to be sure that was given to them equally, and that's the promise I made her. The caretaking with her, it's knowing what is the right thing to do. In retrospect, if I could correct it, I would have said to her, "If you would like to stay home, no matter how sick you get, I'll agree to that, but we'll have to use some of your money for a registered nurse, not just a caregiver." And she did not want to spend that money. And when I put her in a home, because she had that money, we had to pay for that at home, which was not terribly expensive. That, it wasn't a fancy place. It wasn't a $5,000 a month place, but it was a nice home, and it was, very clean, nice, comfortable, decent staff, and all that. But But in retrospect, I think I wish I would have. I wish I would have pressured her to spend her own money too. I didn't have the money at the time. I mean, I could not afford it either. But I wish I could have used that money to have a nurse come in at least 8 hours a day while I was working.
Yeah, well, I think it's, obviously whenever we reflect on it back on experiences, it's kind of the, hindsight is 2020, right? But I do what I think is important about your story, and what I do hope that our listeners are taking away, is one of the biggest challenges that I see in my work and even in my own situations in our family and in the other side of my family is people aren't talking enough. They're not talking enough about aging, about death and dying, about wishes, right? Like, what are all the things I want to have happen? And I think also, too, what I'm trying to do through Sandwiched and through our work with Tumbleweed is bring up what are things that people aren't thinking about that they really should be. And what I heard was your sister's wishes was to preserve as much of her money and estate as she could to leave to her children. Okay, that's the wish. But to your point, there's other parts of the conversation. Well, here's what that means in your healthcare. It means that you will have to be reliant upon whatever is covered by your insurance or Medicare or Medicaid, like whatever that looks like. Or if you want to pass in our home, right, then let's do hospice, and we're going to need additional care to be able to do that, which means that we're going to have to cut into that savings, right? And so it's nothing is black and white, and nothing's that simple. But I think really what I heard through that is have the deeper, harder conversation.
We did have some of that, and she chose to go to the home opposed to spend that money. I probably could have influenced her more on it, and I didn't push it because I knew how important it was to her. She was divorced. The dad left and pretty much abandoned everybody. And she struggled through that from then on because she never made enough money to really cover everything. And I think I could have, and I couldn't make her do, I wouldn't make her do that, but I probably could have influenced her more on that. But I said, if we stay home, I think we're past the point of this type of care. I think we'll have to hire a nurse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, luckily she, obviously, like anybody who's aging, had some memory decline, but even up till the end, because I saw her up until right before her passing, her memory she obviously was struggling with speaking and very immobile towards the end. But aside from that, like, her memory was pretty well intact. And so I think that that's the benefit, is you got to have those conversations. Even if, it wasn't very in depth, right? It was, at least you got to have those conversations. When you're dealing with a situation like with your mom, where you have Alzheimer's or dementia involved, it's a very different situation.
Very different.
Right? Which is why I always say with people, start having the conversation sooner than you think you need to. Right? Because, my grandfather on my other side, he started getting Alzheimer's late 60s, early 70s, right? So 7 to 8 years before he passed. And I think we sometimes are, naive, or maybe even reject a little bit of the notion of people we care about aging, right?
Yeah, I'm not, as you well know, I'm not afraid to talk about all that.
Yes.
My own stuff is taken care of way beyond where my sister's wasn't. And I update my trust all the time. Not that I have a lot of wealth or anything, but I have, especially after the experience of my sister, I keep clarifying to everyone what I want. And, I'm 80. I just turned 80, as you know. You made me celebrate that AO.
Yes, as you said, we had 80s all over the house.
Yeah, there were 80s everywhere, including the front porch. Which was very nice. But I know exactly what I want to do. But I'm doing things on my own, and I have been more and more, because I know that, 80 might be 90, but it might not be. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I'm also going through the whole memorabilia thing. And as you know, when my brother was here for my birthday, he and I spent hours poring over old photos so that I could make sure what ones he wanted. And my sister did ancestry stuff, so I'm working on that. And it's mostly about my mother's side of the family because my brother wouldn't do the DNA. So my dad's side of the family isn't in there except for facts and figures. But I'm also going through the house, and some of the things I know are people's favorites. I'm looking at designations for those things, and I've got all the medical stuff in line. I've got all the legal stuff in line. The trust is updated every year. And I think people should talk about it because I think that you've heard me say this 100 times. When you're old, people think of you as old. Mm-hmm. The people that I moved here, I didn't know anybody on this side of town. I made friends. I worked. I got, coworkers, acquaintances, people in the stores that see me different times, neighbors, lots of good neighbors. But you're old. They don't know who you were as a person when you're in your work life. They have no knowledge. They don't have any reason to care about that or anything, but it's part of your identity. So, as you know, we've been working on legacy planning for my life. I've had a fairly exciting life. I've had, some long-term careers and a lot of little careers that, I went different directions to do something different than what I had done for so many years. And I want to have the things that mattered to me, the things that I care about. I want my family to know about those things and the pleasure it was to have a family. My kids were so important to me. I wanted 8 kids.
You got 3.
I ended up with 3 due to some medical problems, but that was a very important part of my life and still is. And love the fact that I have not only grandchildren, but great-grandchildren. You're my oldest grandchild.
Yes, I am.
And I took care of you a lot when you were little.
Yeah.
And I have, all those pictures and all those memories. And it's been overall, I would say I've been having a pretty exciting, pretty good life.
Yeah.
And, road bumps along the way and hard times along the way, but I'm pretty content.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to something with your kids, my dad and my aunt and uncle. Any idea why they don't want to talk about your... Well, you will not be here forever. Like, that's the reality.
They don't want to face that you won't be here forever. That's the thing. They don't want to face it. Me losing my dad at a very young age, he was 42. I was, I think, just turning 18 or just turned 18. That was a shocker.
Yeah.
My mother was a sick one all my growing up years, not my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And then my dad's the one who died. And so I think that taught me that it was really important to face that those things happen. And after I saw how it shut my mother down for so long, that's something I wouldn't want to happen to my kids. But my kids like to pretend that I'm not going to die. And, they know it. They know it in their intellect, but emotionally they're not wanting to discuss it. So I do have conversations with them that they don't necessarily shut me up, but they're not comfortable with it, but I still talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I asked the question because you and I are more similar in that we both are more comfortable in the conversation. I mean, I worked in healthcare, but I've identified my own story is actually tied to facing my own mortality as a teenager, which I've actually never shared with you. It was when I was identifying that I was gay.
Yeah.
And I'm a child of the 80s.
Yeah.
So I grew up around the AIDS pandemic. You're gay, you get AIDS, you die.
Yeah.
So before I even started coming out, I navigated that I was going to die as soon as I came out as a gay person. Not true. Definitely not true. But that's all I heard. That's what I grew up around. 80s and 90s, right? It was the gay cancer, and then it was your age, you're going to die. So I also wonder, is it being influenced by mortality at a young age? You were influenced by because you're a dad at 18, right? I was influenced out of my own personal, journey and identity and sexuality. I don't know. I don't think we have the answers, but I'm curious why some people are able to lean into conversations more. I try wherever I can to share the stories. And for me, I feel like having faced that and then also been a caregiver and navigating death and dying and work, right? Working in healthcare and then also with family, I do feel like I feel like I live a richer life than I think others do because I'm not ready to die tomorrow, but if I did, I don't fear it in the same way as I think a lot of people do. So I was just kind of curious,
I think one thing with my kids is that I did have a lot of medical near-death experiences throughout my life. Not tons, but I had some severe ones, and my survival was in great question. And it's funny because I've worked so many years, and the only time I have not worked is when I was in the hospital or recovering from a medical situation. But my kids always joke that I always think I'm going to die anytime because I had so many close cuts with dying, and it's just my body is, I've always been strong about work and work ethic, and I like I said, I loved my job, my career. I love my life, good and bad. But they used to always say, "Don't talk about dying. Don't talk about dying. You're not going to die." And I said, "Well, but I want you to be ready in case I do." And they just don't want to hear it.
As you were talking, I actually just had a realization, and I don't know if this is it. Maybe we'll ask them sometime. Is maybe you were just trying to prepare them for what you weren't prepared for, losing your dad at 18.
Yeah, maybe it could be. Because that was...
Maybe you didn't want them to feel the devastation of the loss.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think about so many situations where we try and go almost, maybe not too far, but we do try and go to the other side, right? And so you were trying to prepare them for something that you were not prepared for.
Well, what's interesting is, as you know, Holly, my daughter, was a paramedic for a number of years. And she saw a lot of death. Yeah. And she saw a lot of tragedy, physical tragedy and stuff. So you'd think she'd be more realistic about it. But I think only thing I think about some days is that even though I knew my sister was going to die, even though I did all the steps to take care of everything, and I still, when she died and I walked in there, it was very guttural. It was, I cried in a very guttural way. I felt like an animal. Mm. It was such a loss. And I think that was kind of what I think because I'm so close, that my daughter lives here, as you know. Yeah. And I see her not every day, but I probably see her 3 or 4 times a week. We don't always get to have long conversations because she's still a very active realtor and I'm just a little backup worker, now because of my own health. But she's busy, and it's just sort of having her here even on the phone, mm-hmm. and being interrupted by clients and stuff like that. It's still kind of a comfort. Yeah. To see her, even though sometimes I want to go, get off the phone. But she has to do that. It's the nature of the job. I lived through it. She lived through it. But, it was, I think it's because we're close. She doesn't want to face it. But then I think about, your dad and your uncle. And I think, why won't they talk about it, Yeah. And then I think that by thinking about it, they're both 160 and 162. Mm-hmm. See, I'm questioning.
Yeah. Well, even as you were doing the math, my dad's easier because he just turned 60. But Eric, I was like, yeah, I think he's 62.
Yeah, he's 62. They're also facing their mortality,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
They're at that age where you kind of think, okay, when
You're
I hit
next in
50,
line.
when you hit 50, I know for me it was like, wow, I'm halfway at least.
Yeah.
I'm at least halfway
Yeah.
or more, right? And so people are living longer now. So, I don't know how many more years that I'll be here torturing everybody, but I think that for them, it's got to be, that realization that their mortality is also at least halfway there.
Yeah.
And Holly's husband's, entering retirement, and Eric's thinking about his retirement, and your dad will never retire because he can't hold still. But it's I think it's a fear of the unknown, and if you like life, and if you like your life, it's something you don't really want to give up, even though I know, my faith is strong, and I feel, about my afterlife. I'm confident in that. That is soothing to me, but I still will miss this life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think as you're talking about, I kind of want to go back to, you said the kind of guttural feeling when you walked in after Aunt Linda's passing. And I think as someone who got to watch your relationship and actually lived with both of you at one point in my life together, I mean, you guys are very close. Maybe almost from like watching the two of you together, sometimes annoyingly so, in the sense of like you definitely fought like very close siblings. But I think that also too comes with its benefits of being close. But I also don't know if you remember, but I think it was probably 6 months, give or take, before she passed. And I was visiting, and I told you she's gonna be passing soon. And you were like, no, she's not. She's doing better. She's in the mend. And I was like, this is the path. Do you remember that conversation?
I do.
And it's interesting because we're actually sitting in your home recording this. And I was actually standing over there looking at Aunt Linda lying down, and I knew right away. So it's kind of an interesting revisiting this conversation. And you talking about, I feel there's a little bit of like, you kind of had an inclination, but also too, there was still a lot of hope, even up until those moments at the very end where she would pull through.
Yeah, I think it's the not wanting to give in and give up. I knew, well, actually, when I saw how much weight she'd really lost under all those sweaters and stuff, that was at the point I knew we were on that road and that path, and it just scared the heck out of me.
Yeah.
Because how could I be in the house with a woman every day, and she always had a blanket on, as you know,
yes,
always. And in the summer, when we're all dying of heat, she's freezing. And in the winter, when the heater's on, she's still freezing.
Yep.
But she always had on layers. And even when I was helping her with, getting into bed, she had on pajamas that covered her. And she was heavy to lift onto the bed. So it just didn't register until I saw her that day.
Got it.
And it was like, it would be like you saying, half the town blew up. I mean, that's how shocking it was to me, that how could you be this way?
Yeah.
I'm feeding you, but I wasn't here all day to feed her every meal. And
and I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be. I mean, I knew Aunt Linda, and I'd been around death and dying enough that I could recognize some of the signs. So that was my perspective. But I do, from what I understand and listening to a lot of experts in this space, like the body does prepare. The body does start preparing, and it starts preparing far longer than most people realize. Can be a year or two even before someone's passing where the body starts to prepare. And so to your point, it really could have been like a light switch. It could have happened that fast, and just kind of the slowing down and the preparation
Right.
for,
Right.
death. Not to, and I say that in, I think sometimes we reflect and we give ourselves a hard time in some of the situations when we're just doing the best we can. Right? I mean, to your point, like, you weren't generally seeing your sister. It sounds like if she was preparing for a shower, she was probably naked, right? Or getting ready to be. And that's why you saw her without the layers of clothing.
Right, because I didn't go in her bathroom unless
Exactly.
she asked me for help. I didn't go in her room.
Yeah.
I mean, she had her privacy. I had my privacy. I always respected that. But I think that, two of her kids out of the four have said to me repeatedly, I think she wanted to die.
Yeah.
I think she was tired. She was just ready to give in. I think getting sick with her heart was really, I know it was really scary for her, because I remember every time AFib hit and she knew what she could do for herself, the doctor had told her, you can do this and this. But with me here, of course, she called for me. And as a result of her having those episodes, sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night because I swear I heard her call me.
Yeah.
And I would go in her room and check on her and just make sure she was breathing. Sometimes I didn't want to turn on her light, so I'd turn on the hall light and I would stand there to wait to see if her chest was moving, to see if she was still breathing. And so I think that, you're unconsciously and maybe refusing to be conscious about it, but you kind of know it's going that way. And I think in my own self, I feel my body slowing down. I feel my limitations greater. I still fight them. I still fight to, get strength back and things like that. But my sister had chronic depression most of her life. And her chronic depression was severe through much of her, say her 40s on. She had really severe depression. Never got over that divorce. And I think that gave her, or that didn't give her the same fight to push harder and to try and hang on longer because of that depression. And that's another thing, depression has a great impact.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, that's one of the things that I saw the difference between her and I is she was not a fighter. She was, you experienced it when you lived with us. Her depression was always there.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And I think, mental illness and depression, right? Because I've grown up with Aunt Linda, and obviously, lots of depression on both sides of my family. I've experienced it. A well-lived life looks different for each of us, right? And I won't speak for Aunt Linda, but I will say from my perspective, I do think she made some decisions to kind of start to allow herself to let go. What that means or what that looks like, who actually knows, right? And, a lot of experts in this space, or, people even, you hear it in different areas, but they do say that there's kind of a choice that you kind of can make as you get to a certain place, whether or not that's true, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll know once I get there, I suppose.
Yeah.
But if that is true, I do think, I would say I agree that I kind of saw it a couple of years before, and, definitely as things get closer. But I think also too, it's important to recognize, as someone who is, not half your age, but, close to it, like, we have limitations at every milestone, right? I'm 42. I feel my knees. Like, me and one of my very good friends joke about, like, we both hit 40 and was like, what the heck is going on with this? Like, you just feel things different. Your energy shifts, and I think it's, yes, how do you push through? And also, how do you recognize your own limitations, right? It's not to say like, oh, this is a limit, so I give up, but I think it is finding that balance. That's been kind of interesting. But I'm curious, you had said something earlier that I wanted to kind of use as an anchor to kind of start helping us close out the conversation. You talked about your kids, kind of coming up to maybe facing their own mortality. So whether or not my dad and aunt and uncle actually do face their own mortality, or yours for that matter, what would you say to others who are listening who might be at that age where they're starting to see it in someone else or starting to think about it for themselves?
I think I think you have to be in a special place with that person to talk about it, because I've thought about it a lot. In those last hours of my mother living before I went over to the gym, uh, she couldn't speak. She We would give her the little popsicle water
Yeah.
thing to moisten her mouth, and you could see her struggle. And both Linda and I said to her, we were each on one side of her, and I said, "Mom, it's okay. It's okay for you to go. If you're tired and you're ready, it's okay." And to kind of give permission, because I think there's also some, not just not wanting to go, but I don't know what the end of everybody's life is like. My dad didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Um, I felt a certain amount of pride about my dad because one of his friends was driving behind him, and they were doing something called bobtailing. When they had delivered their load and didn't have a load to take back, their trailer was empty, they bobtailed. The trailer was more movable, right? So they drove more carefully. But, they would also sometimes play getting in front of each other and going back and forth just to pass the time, right? It was about a 60-mile distance that day. Well, the guy that was behind him said he thinks my dad got a warning because he saw they were bobtailing, and he got behind my dad, and he saw my dad start to slow down. He veered across the road, there was no traffic coming, and into a farmer's field and stopped his truck. Ahead of my dad was a school bus stop letting off children after school. That driver told us, I think Al saw that and knew to get off the road, because he said he didn't do a rough down the driveway over the edge of there's a lot of trenches by the roads out in the countries. He sort of guided his truck into the field and stopped. When he got out of his truck and got my dad's door open, he was dead, and his head was on the steering wheel, and that blood clot took him pretty quick. So if he had that warning, it had to be a few minutes, because he didn't hit that school bus. And so I think that I have this feeling, and I won't know, and I probably won't be able to tell you afterwards, but I have this feeling that unless you're asleep, which would be very convenient, I think and I think he knew. And I had a certain amount of pride that he did not hit that bus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, who knows what it will be like for each person, but I think that talking about it and being realistic about it is just the right thing to do, because people need to know how to handle you, or maybe not handle's the right word, but how to interface with you and be okay with it. Because how many people die of cancer every day that the family says, well, now they're not hurting, now they're not in pain, now they don't have to live with that pain. And there's a certain relief that comes with that. For my mom, it was harder. It was not harder for her, it was harder for us, because was she lucky that she had Alzheimer's and didn't know what was happening? I still think it would be better to know, to know what's going on with yourself instead of being confused by it, But that's my opinion.
Yeah.
I'm a practical person.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, unfortunately, we don't really get choices in some of these matters, right? And so I think, to your point, we don't always know, but I do agree that talking more about it is important. That's my perspective.
What really, I'm interrupting you, but what really frustrates me when I talk to other people about it is, if I talk to people, do you have a trust? Do you have a will? Oh my gosh, do you know how very important that is? How very important it is to have a medical designated person or a person designated to make your decisions for you that will follow your wishes. How very important that is, because people can lose everything.
Yeah.
I mean, they want their family to have what they have, but that's not how the law works.
No, it's not.
You can't just wish that. You have to take care of that. That's a responsibility. And luckily, I got through to my brother recently, and him and his wife just did their trust. And I'm so happy for it, because they both come from divorces and married, and, after their children were grown. And so they just avoided a whole lot of problems. And they got that taken care of, and they've got the right person designated for that and everything. And so I talk about it even if people don't want to. And my friends and relatives, I say, do you have this? Do you have that? I say, if you don't, you need to do it. You don't have to get a real expensive lawyer necessarily, unless you have a lot of wealth that most of the people I know don't have. So, and I didn't have, but I think it's so important to talk about it and talk about who's going to do what.
Yep.
Everyone, now all of my kids, as you know, they know that Holly and you are going to work together to take care of things. They know that. And they know that I made that choice. You're available to do that most of the time. Holly is right here. The boys are not. They will have to make arrangements, and doing that from a distance is really hard.
Well, I think that, yes, I'm glad that you're talking to people about it, because, obviously I work in an industry where that's what we're trying to help people realize that. Right. And it can feel salesy, and that's not the goal. It really is to mitigate probate. It's to mitigate infighting. It's to mitigate discomfort. I mean, there's so many layers of complexity to it. So thank you for, helping to influence the population, but also too, not everyone should do every part, right? Whether it's your children, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your sister, right? Some people are going to be able to manage and navigate the financial components better. Others, maybe the healthcare.
Right. It doesn't
Others,
have to be
the logistics.
One person.
No. And so I think that, it is important that people talk about it and to document it, because we don't always know.
Yeah.
In your situation, we actually talked about 3 different deaths. We talked about your dad, your mom, and your sister. Your dad, completely unexpected at 49, right? None of us expect to go at 49.
Right.
And I'm sure he didn't have things prepared,
Not at all.
Luckily, it was probably relatively simple, because most of everything would have just went to your mom at the time. But things are more complex now. They're getting harder. You have to get probate involved and lawyers, right? And so it's just, it's very interesting.
So actually, even then, my dad had insurance, and the insurance on the house to pay the house off, plus life insurance, which back in the 50s, well, he died in the 60s, but it wasn't very much.
Yeah.
But my sister and my brother and I were also beneficiaries. But because we were all minors, the insurance person told us, you kids need to sign off on these so your mother gets the money.
Yeah.
And that's all it took. But in this litigious society,
it'd be a lot more complex.
That could never work.
Yeah, definitely. So as we wrap up, what would you say to someone who is just stepping into the family caregiver role?
Make sure your heart is in it and your head, because just caring and wanting to do it isn't enough. You have to be strong. You have to deal with a lot of controversy. Maybe you'll have a simple, smooth process, but most likely, if there's a family and children and there's differences of opinions, you're going to come in contact with even like friendly fire. But you have to be strong enough to say, I am willing to do what this person has asked me to do, no matter what. I am willing to stand up for exactly what they told me they wanted and see that through to the end. And it can take a toll on you. As you know, it took a toll on me. But you have to be strong enough to do that. I just think you have to have not just your heart in it, but your head in it.
Yeah. Well, Graham, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to our listeners or watchers?
Well, I would just say it's. I'm happy to hope I made a contribution to you, and I'm very proud of you for the field that you're in, and that you are doing something so critical for people and helping get the word out. And I think your podcast, I like I said, I've learned things from each of your podcasts saying, oh, that was a good idea. Oh, I should have tried that. I never thought of that. And I think if people would watch your podcasts, they don't have to watch me, but watch your podcasts, they would also get more comfortable with the whole thing, with the whole thing, because people have to get more real about it to have it not be. It could be a tragedy in their life beyond the death of the person if they're not prepared. And you don't have to sit around waiting for people to die.
Yeah.
You just take care of it, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you had said it earlier, but I think also to revisit it, right?
Revisit it. You
make
have to
updates, I think that's something people forget.
That's
so it's a good reminder of the goal is to have as much money of your estate go to whomever you want it to be, your children, your grandchildren, a trust, a beneficiary, a nonprofit, whatever it is, then do the work and take a little bit of time and revisit it. Most estate recommend every year. I say at least every 3 to 5 years, because I don't think most people are gonna do it every year, but it's a good reminder to do that. All right. Well, Diane Aden, Graham, thank you for joining me today. And to all of you out there, this conversation feels like the perfect way to close season 1. I can't believe it's already the end of season 1. Sandwiched, and throughout the season we've heard from over and over again that no one plans to become a caregiver, and honestly most situations are fully planned for end of life. So it's important for us to remember that caregiving shapes our lives. It really can impact us personally, professionally, and in family dynamics. So to everyone listening and who's joined us for season 1, thank you, and we will see you in 2026 for season 2. Thank you so much. Sandwiched is a Second Act studio production with production support by Brennan Plank and the Tumbleweed team. We thank Tumbleweed for their support. And remember, we are better together. See you next week.